Welcome to episode 75 of I Thought I Knew How, a podcast about knitting and life and all sorts. I'm your host, Anne Frost, and this episode was recorded on January 27th, 2022. I have an interview for you today with Katie Sullivan of Bobolink Yarns, which produces New England wool yarns, many of them breed-specific, some of them farm-specific. We are going to start learning more about American-based wool producers this year, my friends. Let's get started. First, I want to welcome Elizabeth as a new patron of the podcast. Thank you to her and to all my patrons who cover the costs of running the podcast. Patrons make a monthly contribution to running the show and receive some benefits in return, like monthly knit nights scattered through the month at the $5 and higher level. If you'd like to help support my work here on the podcast, please hop over to patreon.com/IThoughtIKnewHow to learn more. Another way you can support the podcast is by hopping over to Apple Podcasts and leaving a 5-star review with a kind comment. That helps the podcast show up higher in the rankings when people search for knitting podcasts, so thank you for that. If you are not a fan of Apple Podcasts for some reason, a positive review left where you do listen will be greatly appreciated as well. While I'm at all my thanking, I'd like to also thank Knit New Haven in New Haven, Connecticut for sponsoring the podcast. Find their online offerings, including classes and knit nights, at knitnewhaven.com. Likewise, many thanks to Morehouse Farm for sponsoring the I Thought I Knew How. Erin from Morehouse Farm hosts a knitting community with instructive knit-alongs happening monthly. Find out more at morehousemarinoflock.com. I have spoken a lot about British wools in the podcast in the past, and this year I would like to make more of an effort to learn about the wools in my own backyard, metaphorically speaking. For me, that means the yarn of the northeastern United States. I live in Connecticut in a community that is still relatively agricultural. There are folks around here keeping sheep, travel farther north into Massachusetts and Vermont and New Hampshire, and there are more flocks. These days, most of the flocks in New England and New York State are comparatively small, both in terms of what they were like 150 years ago and on the world stage where large-scale sheep farmers can have flocks in the tens of thousands. But those animals, wherever they are almost all producing wool that can be spun into yarn, and what is happening with it all? For many, the answer has been composting or storing the wool in the hope that at some future date, it will be economically wise to do something with it. But having it processed into wool is costly in terms of finances and time, and many farmers lack the marketing skills needed to promote the product themselves. We as knitters think, just send it to the mill and we'll buy it, but it really is not that simple. And with the market for wool in a relatively depressed state, there isn't the economic incentive for most individual farmers to have fleeces processed into yarn. I've said it before and I'll say it again, the more we use wool in our crafting and other areas in our homes, the more wool we will have access to. Katie Sullivan is someone who is helping to bring more wool yarn to the market for us. First as the owner of Cloverworks Farm and now as the force behind Bobolink Yarns. Katie is working with local farmers in Vermont to collect their fleeces and have them spun and dyed into breed and farm-specific yarns for us to work with. I first came across Bobolink Yarns while on the Great Northern Yarn Haul a few years ago, where it was proudly displayed in many yarn stores in Vermont who highlighted the wonderful yarns being produced in their state. I would love to see other yarn stores follow their example of drawing attention to local wools. I really would, especially shops that participate in yarn crawls. If I'm going to drive around a whole region of the country to visit a selection of yarn shops, it would be extra fantastic to be able to buy locally produced yarns while I'm doing it. I'm just putting that out there. And while I'm at it, hand dyers? We all love a good merino superwash when the project calls for it, but I'd be super interested in seeing some of your amazing colorways on locally grown wools. I know I may be asking for too much on that one, but a girl can dream. Enough dreaming now. Let's hear from someone who's doing. Please enjoy my interview with Katie Sullivan of Bobolink Yarns. Katie Sullivan, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me and my listeners about Bobolink Yarns and your other endeavors you have going on.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm really, really excited to talk with you today.
One of the things I sort of always ask people, because everybody's always interested, is how and when you got started knitting yourself.
Oh gosh, when did I start knitting? I must have been like 6 or 7. My mother has always been a really strong and dedicated knitter. She learned at her grandmother's knee when she was 5, 6, 7. I remember making a terrible, absolutely terrible flat sweater for a small teddy bear I had. And I was so nervous about dropping a stitch that I picked up about 20 stitches on the sweater. And I remember, I don't know how to, do this in language and not like demonstration with my hands, but I remember a sweater that had probably 15 stitches on the left side and probably 25 stitches on the right side. So it just kind of grew and grew and grew because of my worry about dropping anything. So kind of imagine a coat with tails, but only one tail. My first knitting thing, but my mother's been knitting me beautiful sweaters, including the one I'm wearing today, my entire life. And I've never really quite developed the talent and skill that she has, but I do at least have a sense of like what knitting, the comfort that knitting provides, how it's done, what I like in a yarn, what I don't care for in a yarn, and what I like in a finished garment, what qualities I prefer in that. So just enough knowledge to be dangerous, I guess I would say.
So you started knitting at an early age, but my understanding is you didn't grow up on a farm. Nope. Is that correct?
I grew up in a suburban ranch house amid other suburban ranch houses. My path to sheep is kind of, I think, a more common millennial path, which is I worked in social services for a couple of years after college, and it didn't take me long to really, I think, burn out on giving and really come to struggle with, what is the meaning of trying to help others in a world that kind of just seems to grind people up. And so I was looking for a place to take comfort. And then the Great Recession happened and everybody my age lost their jobs because we're all, 2 years in and at the bottom of the heap. And that's when I got to reading like Michael Pollan and reading about farming. And I thought, maybe that's what I should be doing. Maybe I should be doing something a little more tangible, a little closer to the earth. And so there was a couple of false starts to get started farming, but eventually I wound up working at a goat farm. And then from there, I was able to kind of get connected in rural areas and like get accustomed to being in rural areas, obtain some sheep.
And you, I believe you have border Leicester and blue-faced Leicester. Is that correct?
I have blue-faced Leicesters. I have 14 gorgeous blue-faced Leicesters, and I am the president of Blue, the Blue-faced Leicester Union of North America.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. That's, I think that's been a really great experience as well, just connecting to other shepherds about a breed that I really care about. And there's cool stuff happening with that breed as well.
Yeah. What can you tell me about blue-faced Leicesters?
Sheep wool categories, typically roughly divided into fine wool, so merino and merino related breeds, down wool, Cheviots, Dorsets, anything kind of springy and full of body and rather short. Primitive wool, anything dual coated, natural colored, and then long wool. And blue-faced Leicesters are the finest of the long wool sheep. In the time in England when wool was very valuable, farmers thought, well, if wool's so valuable, let's see if we can breed sheep to grow more and more of it, right? And so they're like, we'll grow it longer, and then we can use it in applications like rugs and drapey fabrics where long wool would be appropriate. Blue-faced Leicesters give about 2 to 3 pounds of very light fleece of perfect little doll hair curls, tiny little pearled, shiny, glossy curls. I love their wool because it's kind of pre-skirted. I think it's easy for a casual knitter to look at a sheep with wool on its head and wool down its legs and think like all that wool has equal value. But in fact, all that wool on legs and heads and necks typically gets dirty. Typically it's fairly short. And usually it's kind of ends up on the ground during skirting. So blue-faced Leicesters are kind of pre-skirted. They only grow wool in the areas of the body where that wool is going to be most valuable. So I love my very simple, low maintenance BFL wool. If you think about dogs on a spectrum from Malamutes, which are kind of like wolves with manners, all the way into human intervention to pugs and poodles, I would describe blue-faced Leicesters down at the pug end of breeding. We've asked a lot of them genetically, right? We've given them these gray ears. We've given them this tremendous Roman nose. We've given them, a very specific body type and a very specific wool. And consequently, I find as a breed, they breed very true, because they, any two blue-faced Leicesters are going to make a blue-faced Leicester who normally looks, it's the right size and the right shape. But the other side of the coin is that they're a genetically small breed. Think of a small town where nobody leaves and no one enters. It's a little bit genetically small if everybody's last name. And in blue-faced Leicesters, I would say there's only like 2 or 3 last names. Genetically. And so we are always working as a breed organization to bring in more UK genetics and try to keep everybody like strong and healthy, but also following breed standard. Shetlands are a huge breed, and there's tall, like ones that are taller and ones that are shorter, and several variations of wool, and kind of endless discussions within among Shetland breeders about, the wool should be this coarse, that coarse, softer, lighter, fuller, thicker. There's not that kind of debate in BFLs. We pretty much have what we want, and the question is continuing it without inbreeding.
Right. So I was going to ask, does the organization then help with around breeding time to help arrange for rams to travel where needed?
The breed association we're not going to write a check to pay your livestock transport.
Oh, no.
So
Yeah.
Provide a forum for people to exchange information. We've really worked on our website quite a bit to make it a little bit more useful and usable, and to kind of keep it fresh and lively. It's been really tough during the pandemic. We used to meet at shows and events, while knitters and crocheters are having their Rhinebeck in the vendor booths. We're having our little Rhinebeck over in the sheep area talking with each other. And that's actually a major nexus for Western producers bringing some sheep east. Or, I've brought a sheep to Rhinebeck and put it in a truck, and then it goes to Ohio, right? That's a really important part of my Rhinebeck is connecting with other shepherds, as well as meeting all the knitters and crocheters who really like my yarn.
Interesting. How long was it that you had your sheep before you decided that you wanted to start processing their wool?
I knew from as soon as I got 5 mutt sheep. The first, my first sheep were 5 mutts from this old shepherd who he was sitting at the farm show, just hand spinning this beautiful roving that he had. And I asked him what kind of sheep he had, and he said Montreals, in like an old kind of Vermont accent. And I ended up with some sheep who'd really never been handled. I think that Chris had he still had sheep, but he was a little past really handling them intensively. So they were almost wild. Right. And I really had to learn from the ground up how to kind of bring them in and train them and make them trust me and really gain their trust and learn them as well. But as soon as I had those sheep, Mom and I looked at that wool and were like, this needs to be something wonderful. And luckily in Vermont, there's a lot of mill resources here. So I was able to find a really nice mill, and the owner of the mill opened my bag and he said, now this is wool. And so I was like, all right, I've done something right. And we probably made 120 skeins of yarn that first year. And we show up at the Vermont Sheep and Wool Festival, all ready to go with our tiny little display that was solidly the humblest of all ventures there. But I felt like $1 million. I was like, check out my 5 sheep and our tiny little pile of yarn. And my mother had knit, I think, a shawl out of some of it just to show what it could do. And, it sold all right. And I felt like, there's something in this, there's something here. And so the next year I had more sheep and more wool and more yarn and a better plan. And we invented, Mom wrote a pattern called the Vermont Sheepscape hat. It just has some little sheep with a hilly background. Awkwardly, although it is absolutely not the same as the Shetland Wool Week bobble hat, it kind of came out at the same time. Like just similar enough in the idea of like, what if you put sheep on your wool hat? People are like, oh, I've seen that hat. And I'm like, it's not the Shetland Wool Week hat. It really was like definitely not if you take a look at it, but also like awkward. In any case, like it kind of just snowballed gradually. And eventually in the winter of 2019, I had a notion of like, I can't raise any more sheep. Like physically, I can't do more than the number of sheep that we have. Like I've got some health stuff, so I can't like, I'm also just like not 22, right? And so I just had the idea, I know a bunch of other shepherds at this point, 8 years into sheep raising. I know a bunch of shepherds with garages full of wool that they're not doing anything with. And it's nice. Like some of it's nice, some of it's no good, some of it's nice. But I wonder if like the smart move isn't to expand what's most successful about my farm at this point, which is the wool side. Like doing meat is really, that was always one of my economic focuses, just trying to get sheep to be economically viable by using everything they produce, producing pelts, producing lamb, producing wool, and not leaving anything kind of on the table. But like, keeping a frozen product and like marketing that is a very challenging effort, especially in a saturated market. Whereas producing yarn and doing a really good job marketing it, like there's room there. There's some room there. And so that's kind of how Bobolink was born. I had, at the same time as I realized I have friends with, barns full of unused wool, I also had yarn shops contacting me saying, we'd really like to carry some local wool. Like, would you wholesale this? And I said, well, I can't because I've matched the amount of, yarn fiber festivals I do to the amount of sheep I have, right? So, 40 sheep is 2 fiber festivals worth and 50 sheep is 3. So I never really had any room to do extensive wholesale, but, other farms have endless wool and I can produce as much yarn as I think I can wholesale. And that was kind of making that connection, I think was my my moment to really bring Bobolink into being.
That's wonderful. Now you bring up something about, these wool producers, wool growers who are ending up with just wool in storage. I know in the UK, they have the British Wool Board where small producers can sell directly to the wool board and just have it gone. Is there not something like that in the United States?
There is. Vermont has a wool pool.
Okay.
Typically, it has been purchased by a woolen yarn mill in Maine. I think last year's price for wool was 30 or 35 cents a pound, which if you do the math, I think my shearer currently charges $7 per sheep plus a $50 setup fee. So as soon as you do the math on, how much wool a sheep produces and that setup fee, you're looking at something like $10 per sheep for shearing. So that sheep would have to produce 40 pounds of wool. Sheep don't produce 40 pounds of wool. They do like 5, 6 at most. So you're already like, that's a loss. That's like a financial for them. I think the thing that surprises, I guess I should back up a smidge. The thing that I think surprises folks in the knitting, crochet, fiber arts realm is how many sheep raisers are raising sheep primarily for meat and not primarily with fiber in mind. If you have a friend and your friend has 3 sheep, most likely they're pets or they, do some hand spinning. However, if you have a friend and that your friend has 500 sheep, that is definitely going to be like a lamb operation. And those 500 sheep are going to simply produce more wool than anybody could ever handle in a year. And I think the other thing to remember is, while wool as a raw material doesn't have that much value, the cost of production for actually making yarn out of that wool is quite high. So if you're a farmer and it's April and you sold your lamb from last year and you're not going to have any more lamb until August, but you've got a grain bill coming, the last thing you're going to do is write a large check to a fiber mill to have your wool made into something so that you have it all summer and have to wait until next winter to sell it when folks are really in the mood for yarn. So it just, as an economic as an economic factor in large-scale sheep farming, the wool is, if anything, just a pain in some farmers' butts, right? Like it's really just an impediment to them. And what I would like to do is capture that value and give the farmer more than 35 cents for their hard work, and really show, show local fiber artists how much wonderful wool we produce here. Britain has a completely different organization of how they handle wool and livestock in general, because I think the Brits on the whole are a little bit more comfortable with a world where the government tells you what you do and don't do, or the government manages their farming just a little bit differently than in the US, where we just don't, like, that is just not our culture. So there's, advantages to both systems for sure. Like the British farming, I think on the whole is better supported, but also you lose the option potentially of kind of doing your own thing with your own products.
Right. I have heard some sheep raisers, shepherds, talking about how it's really, they see the shearing isn't done for the purpose of the wool, it's done for the purpose of the health of the animal in their eyes. It needs to be done for the animal. But as you say, it's not worth then taking and having processed because of the costs associated with it. So how then are you, as Bobolink Yarns, able to capitalize on that stored value?
We capitalize on the value of the wool, I think, by recognizing, what is best about the wool from any given breed, and really trying to create a yarn that flatters that wool. A lot of folks that I've worked with have tried the yarn route before. And, you go into their farm store and you see kind of some nubbly balls of like tightly woolen spun yarn that like is kind of coarse and kind of rugged. And you understand why like nobody's been scooping that up. I think I've been lucky to work with some really excellent mills who, because I don't have a preconceived notion of what the wool needs to be, we can have a productive discussion about like, how would you spin this and why? And like, what do you think? And we can kind of come to some terms that make the most sense. I can respond easily to trends in knitting. I've had a lot of success producing fingering weight yarn, which a lot of producers, that's a little more expensive to produce. But because I'm not using my own wool, and because I can produce 100-pound lots instead of 10-pound lots, I can get like a little bit better deal on that. I think a lot of it is also, mom's my secret weapon. Mom, she's been knitting for 60 years. She does pattern design. She's comfortable teaching. She taught for many years at the Fiber Studio in Henniker, New Hampshire. She is really comfortable with like really intricate knitting and like really advanced techniques, but she's also been a teacher for a number of years, like teaching students generally. And so she knows how to kind of word things so that people feel braver about trying a provisional cast on, or, doing some steeking or what have you. So she's able to, once we get a really nice yarn made, we're able to come up with an even better pattern to show how nice that yarn can be. So we're really making the most out of wool that is, frankly, typically just a little coarser than what folks are used to at most yarn shops. Something I've learned about and going into yarn shops and just feeling my way around is that a lot of knitters think that soft is all that counts. And the best way to make your sweater is with a really nice merino. And then you see, you go on Ravelry and you see this yarn pilled. Like, how do you get rid of the pills? This is pilling while I'm knitting it. Well, sometimes the answer is a little bit coarser wool with a longer staple that will stay in the sweater and not pill out. We're doing fiber artist education all of the time too, around, when would you choose a wool that is just a little less soft, but with all the advantages of a longer staple length of each fiber so that it doesn't tend to work its way out of the garment.
I actually encountered Bobolink Yarns while doing the Great Northern Yarn Haul and just kept seeing it in different shops, and first of all, I was so impressed by the yarn shops in Vermont and how many of them were spotlighting local yarn, which you don't see in a lot of yarn stores. And Bobolink was there. like, I just felt like everywhere I went. So it's like, okay, I'm going to, really dive into this. And one of the shops had a great big display of it. And I was really impressed by the fact that it is breed specific or farm specific. I'm not quite sure whether it's breed specific or farm. Okay. Because I did notice
a little, like, the secret is, like, if I have to kind of engineer it just a little bit, anything that you purchase that says it's from this farm and is this breed is no less than like 90% that. But if it, if somebody sells me like 2 fleeces that's the same breed as a huge farm, that I would just put those fleeces in there. We can't be too religious about it, right? Like, you can't be too religious about it. Most larger farms raise 1 or 2 breeds, and like kind of the larger they are, the more likely they are to have, 30 of this kind and 30 of that kind. But that's plenty of sheep to make a breed specific, flock specific wool, from any given farm. I don't force anybody to sign any contracts, right? So if any farm decides that they would like to do something else entirely with their wool next year, like, I'm not going to stand in their way, because even though I pay more than the wool pool, I can't pay, what hand spinners would pay for hand spinning fleeces, right? Just because the yarn would be obscenely expensive. I'm paying 10 times the wool pool price. So I'll pay some producers, if they produce something very nice, $3.50 or $4 a pound. But in your skein of yarn, that's like a 50 cents, 60 cent difference. And I would hope that that fiber artists would feel comfortable paying 50 or 60 cents more per skein, so that farmers can at least like break even and maybe profit a little bit off their wool, instead of, in effect, kind of having it appropriated from them for less than their cost of production.
Yeah.
I'm looking for farms that have 40 or 50 sheep that are one or 2 breeds, and working with them if they don't already have an existing outlet for their fiber.
Do you have farmers who are approaching you now to be?
Oh, yeah. Often. And a lot of that comes to, on larger farms with more kind of with more mechanization, it is more likely that what I'll encounter is 30 sheep with usable wool. Small farmers, often it's a matter of education around how to get that wool nicer. And once they do get it nicer, then I typically recommend that they sell it to the hand spinning market, right? I have somebody who's in touch with me about some fin fleece, and I'm like, this is beautiful fleece. Like, if I pay you $4 a pound for this, I feel like I'm stealing it. And if you don't want to market it yourself, I will do that. I'll buy that from you gratefully. But if you want to market yourself, like, here's some tips. And really, I just care that people realize the value of what they produce. If they just don't want to put the footwork in, like, I'll take it, absolutely. And if they do want to learn, get a little invitation into the fiber community, I will also provide them with that kind of information.
Wonderful.
Like, I got to make a little money because I like to eat, but for the most part, I want people to recognize the value of the wool in New England. Like, New England has wonderful wool. We've had wonderful wool for 400 years, and we just need to kind of rediscover what's in our own backyards. I feel like the pandemic and like shipping changes have, I hope, made people realize that their skein of wool from Michael's or Joanne's, started life in Australia or South Africa, was sent to China or Peru, or China and Peru, and then containered in a ship here and is sitting off the port of Los Angeles right now in a container ship not moving. Like, we have that resource in our own backyards, and I think we just have to recognize its value.
Yeah, absolutely. It's amazing to read about the history of sheep and wool in this part of the world, and how, merinos came to the New World through Connecticut and spread through Vermont. And there were flocks, 1 million sheep in Vermont that were merinos at one point. And since then it's diversified quite a bit, but we do still have.
They found out that there was this place called Ohio that was flat and fertile and didn't have so many flocks, and they moved the sheep that way. And then they discovered Wyoming that was nice and dry, and the wool could be finer because the weather was better for fine wool.
Yeah.
New England doesn't really, producing fine wool in New England is a struggle. I guess I would phrase it that way. People do it. People do it successfully, but you have to be very hands-on about your wool management, and you don't see that in flocks of 100 or 200 sheep. You just can't, be coating.
Right.
Right. That's not realistic.
We do still have the sheep here, and we are still producing the wool here. And as I was saying before, I appreciate that you keep the Bobolink yarns breed specific, because they do have different ideal uses.
They're very different.
I don't think there's a bad wool out there. There's just different uses for that wool. Could you tell us about some of the different types of breeds that you work with and how they differ from one another?
Sure. We have a Cheviot worsted. Cheviot is a down wool, and we are buying mostly the lamb's wool from this particular flock because every year she raises resplendently beautiful lamb's wool. So we have the lamb's wool that has so much loft and bounce. And in talking to my mill, we came up with the idea of a worsted because if you try to spin it out too fine, you'll kind of suppress the natural crimp of the wool. So we thought, let's capture that. Let's make something really squishable. It's not soft like merino. It's not, but it is soft to me. And it passed the will a bald man wear it on his scalp test. So, say what you will about that.
Right.
And what I love about that wool is just how squishable and springy it is. It really clings to, if you make a hat, it will kind of have some nice bounce and cling, some negative ease. Perfect for a nice thick sweater. Maybe not right for a drapey scarf. Probably not as nice for fine stitch work, as it tends to have a little bit of thick and thin sometimes. But it's one of my favorites. I think my favorite is it's a Clun Forest Sport. And I feel like it's a great just all around yarn because it's a great compromise between bounce and drape. And so I would just use that for virtually any application. And then when we get into the fingerings, I'd say the most distinctive yarn we produce, it's a Coopworth fingering. Every fiber of that Coopworth is 7 to 8 inches long.
Wow.
With a very long, open, kind of sausage curls kind of crimp to it. So this yarn has zero loft. And I hesitate to say the T word twine because it's not twine. It has more than that. And we really were careful about how much twist the mill put on it so that it isn't twine. But you've never seen something with more beautiful, open work, cobwebby drape than this. And if you make a shawl out of it, it will just kind of hug your shoulders. It won't kind of bunch or try to be a stiff fabric. It'll just be with you. So we're still working on a really nice shawl design to go with that Coopworth. The other cool thing about the Coopworth, and this is something that I feel really lucky to have as somebody who works with small producers. Small producers are far more likely to keep black sheep. Some or a flock that's mostly black. And so this Coopworth flock is actually almost all black. Almost every member of the flock is black. So the wool isn't black, but it is a deep, rich steel gray. And so when I overdye the colors, I get these really, really powerful tonals. I can't make a yellow yarn in this, but I can make the richest purple or red or blue that you've ever seen. And to my surprise, but I guess in retrospect, not so surprising, that Coopworth was the hottest thing at Rhinebeck this year. We could barely keep up with how interested folks were in a natural gray Coopworth fingering with so much drape and so much luster. That's the other part about long wools is they have a luster that, merino tends to be almost lusterless. But once you get into the long wools, the structure of the fiber creates a little shimmer. And so this yarn is gleaming.
It starts to look silky, Yeah. It's amazing the different varieties of wool that are out there. And we tend to just think, we just have our preconceived conception of wool, but it's available in so many different forms and so many different uses.
Oh, another exciting, like one that's been terribly popular that I'm quite excited about is a sock yarn that is Montadale Cheviot Cross. And we add 20% nylon to it. And whereas I wouldn't recommend long wools for sock yarn because the socks will just droop right down your ankles, this has the cling of the Cheviot and like the softness of the Montadale spun up with a little nylon. And it's really one of the few non-superwash sock yarns out there. So it's not like I think it's the other thing about Bobolink yarns that I don't even think of because of what I tend to knit with anyway. They're not processed to death, right? They don't feel like they've been through, endless machines and machinings and plasticization and polymerization. And, they're not like sometimes you'll find a little piece of hay because the wool grew on real sheep and that sheep was maybe a sloppy eater. It's just a lot closer. I mean, it's orders of magnitude just closer to the earth and the land that we live on here.
That is something to take into consideration, I think, as we're choosing our wools for our projects. I'm not going to name names for certain brands, but there's certain brands out there that, it's going to be completely uniform and completely, everything's just as it is. But at the same time,
the exact same shade of pink, and you don't even have to think about dye lots. One thing I actually can't do at my scale is dye lots. I am dyeing typically 6 skeins of yarn at a time. So what there is what there is. If somebody in Vermont, somebody can just ring me up and say, I'd like enough for a sweater. I'd really like 15 skeins and I want them all to be, pumpkin orange. I can make that. Like, I just have the shop call me and we'll make that happen. I've done that before. And like, it's like, what if your yarn was also a small town, right? I want people to enjoy this range of color that I produce. So all my yarn is also hand dyed. And so I want you to enjoy the range of colors that I produce. But also if you need a sweater's worth, let me know.
Yeah. What I was going to say though, is that there's a difference in feel between what we call farm yarn, one that hasn't been over processed and sent through however many chemicals and along the way, compared to one of the sort of major brands that has had all that additional processing for the uniformity to it. I love when I'm knitting and I come across a little piece of something in the wool because I know, then I know that all that extra stuff that really isn't necessary hasn't happened in this case. Like just a little bit less gunk and stuff going into the environment as a result.
From a carbon perspective, like a much cleaner, gentler, kinder process. But even on the whole, like wool overall is, even if it's something that went to Asia and South America and Africa and here, is still vastly more environmentally friendly than an equivalent in any kind of plastic-based fiber, right?
Right.
I'd rather see people wear wool in any way than see any more nylon in this world anymore.
So you did sort of touch on the fact that one of the challenges with getting wool from wool to the finished product is really the amount of time and energy that has to go into that, all those in between steps. Which I think even as much as the cost itself of having it done, the time cost is huge for people. And I think a lot of knitters don't realize that as well, that, these wool producers are busy. They're busy, period. Like just busy, full stop. And
I think that's very, here's a good way to look at it. So shearing typically takes place before lambing. And after you shear, you have to skirt the wool. And skirting is it's just very hands-on. It's labor intensive. It requires kind of a relaxed attitude of like 90% is good enough and we're just going to get through this instead of getting really intense about it. I worked with one producer who told me like, should I be using tweezers? And I said, you should for sure not be using tweezers, right? Like sometimes you just have to like take a handful and put it on the ground and feel okay with making executive decisions, doing triage in a very rapid way.
Right.
So a lot of the work that I put into the wool other than yarn design and dyeing and kind of planning and marketing, is getting to know it by skirting everything that I purchase. My preferred method is I would like to show up at your farm on shearing day with my skirting table, and I'm going to set up next to the shearer, and I'm friends with all the shearers, like I know everybody, so they're never surprised to see me. And so I'll set up and every fleece gets tossed on the table and I do my work. And while I'm doing my work, if the shepherd is there, I would love to explain to them, like this one has a wool break. So this sheep probably had a fever at some point, like might be worth keeping an eye on her. Or, this girl like got into the hay and I can't purchase this one. Or like, this is beautiful. And here's what I love about this fleece. And I'll point out, like this has beautiful crimp and luster. And I really want you to like, look at this and make more of her. Right. And these are this is the kind of interaction that I like to have like in an advisory capacity with shepherds, because we both win when they raise prettier wool, right?
Right.
And then I need to do a little bit of planning. The usual turnaround times on Northeastern mills are kind of plus or minus 6 months, which is part of where like cash flow becomes an issue, because you put a deposit in, and then 6 months later you pay the rest, and then you have some yarn on cones, and then you have to skein that, dye it, and then you're ready to sell. So there's a lot of kind of managing of inventory and planning so that I have the yarns that I need at the right time, but I don't have 100 pounds of something that I won't really be able to sell intensely until Rhinebeck rolls around. I seem to have some like ADHD tendencies, and I actually think that's an advantage in this, because my focus is always like everywhere, and so I'm kind of thinking about like what I have in the warehouse as I'm standing at a picking table, like hastily picking through a big fleece. And really, like I sincerely hope that the shepherds find my feedback useful, like whether they can implement it or not, right? Like whether they raise more Cheviets and fewer Dorsets, or whatever the feedback is. Like as I said earlier, what I care about is that they get the most out of what they produce, because it has value to me.
Yeah. And have you seen positives since Bobolink has started in the community?
Yeah, I think so. I think like what I've really like connecting shepherds with each other. It's a very isolated existence. And so I think just making, saying like, oh, we're looking for a ram this year. Oh, I saw this other farm and they have beautiful stock, and maybe you'd like a ram from them. They have the same breed. I can give you their email. Just trying to yenta a little bit, right? Just trying to make some connections. I think because wool is just such a low priority, not a lot of them have made like massive changes to what they've raised, but I've at least been able to prevent disasters. Like, please don't get a hair breed ram and use them on your wool breed ewes and create don't mix them. Do not do that. Nothing good will result. And I'll never be able to purchase the wool again, because if it's half hair, it just can't. I think what's also been useful, sometimes larger shepherds will point beginning shepherds towards me, because I'll like take the time to have a conversation when I'm not busy managing 300 sheep, right? And so I want to give people, when they ask about like what breed they should raise, a really like clear lay of the land about what wools shoppers are looking for. I'm gonna knock a breed a little bit, and I guess don't at me about it. Like, I think that Icelandic sheep were a little bit oversold as far as being a wool breed early on in their arrival in the US, because everybody who sold Icelandics was telling beginning shepherds that knitters would love to work with their wool because it's so many fun colors and it has a soft half. And what I end up having to explain to folks is mills cannot accept Icelandic because the hairs, like the long guard fibers, actually, it's not because mills are jerks. It is because those fibers actually tangle their equipment and make it, if you had to clean 1 million tines of a drum carder, you also would not accept Icelandic. And so I have to explain to them, like, I only have like one mill that will take it, and their prices are a little higher than others. And they've kind of got their own rules about it and how long it can be and what condition it can be in. And if you are if you're just deciding between sheep breeds about something that will generate some wool revenue and some meat revenue, Icelandics are harder to market than some people will tell you that they are.
Got it.
Right. And so we have to have that conversation sometimes.
Yeah, that's definitely something to be aware of as the sheep on the sheep breeder side. And I know there's lots of knitters who do love to knit with Icelandic wool.
Yeah, Icelandic is great.
So it's not, it's not a slam.
Yep. And wonder like cool applications and nifty colors and like definitely like a distinctive style and halo. And you're not going to find that effect with any other wool. But from the perspective of like the practicalities of processing it, if you had a flock of 50 of them, that would present a challenge that people might not anticipate. Exactly. And like likewise, Shetlands, I think beginners think I should get Shetland sheep because they're small and they come in fun colors. Well, Shetlands, like there's some impracticalities around trying to eat a sheep that tops out at 70 pounds.
Right.
Because you end up with very, very small lamb chops.
Yeah.
And their wool is just really challenging to keep clean because of the structure of the wool itself. I've encountered a lot of matted Shetland. And I've had to say, like, this would be perfect wool if it hadn't felted on the sheep because you had her shorn in June, right? Like, and then we do some education and have a conversation. And I want, like, this would be worth $20 a pound, potentially, if you could market it to hand spinners, except that it is now a solid mass, right? Yeah. And like, these are, and I'm not trying to be flip or like, unkind to people. I think I just want, again, like, I just want people to realize the value of what they have. And like, if they wish to have the skills to take care of it, so they can. Yeah,
absolutely. Well, I've been to Shetland several times and talked to wool producers there. And that's something they deal with there too, is with their animals. And the nicest is around the neck and shoulders on a Shetland, but that's also what gets the most friction from the head of the animal. And so it's the nicest, that's great, but there is the risk of that all just matting up on them.
Keep it that way.
Exactly.
That way. Yeah. Don't forget, like, wool grows on a live animal, and that animal has an agenda of her own. I have that conversation with my BFLs all the time. I have one who's carrying triplets, and her back is as flat as a table. And anytime her friends eat hay, they dribble it on her back. And I'm like, please keep your mouths away from 39's back because she has wool and you're ruining it. And they just look at me like, whatever, mom. Words.
Living my life. Where can people learn more about Bobolink Yarns and your Cloverworks Farm yarn, which is your yarn, your specific yarn too? Could you just fill everybody in on how to learn more and where to find it?
Absolutely. Learn more about Bobolink Yarns at bobolinkYarns.com. And because of changes to my own life, I'm actually gradually rolling Cloverworks Farm, kind of subsuming it under Bobolink Yarns, because I know that my future is going to be a little bit more Bobolink Yarns and a little bit, like, I'll keep sheep, but a little bit less emphasis on that. So I think Cloverworks will just become a farm name in Bobolink. But if you want to read my blog and learn about my adventure with my sheep, cloverworksfarm.com for that. Please feel free to email me and find us on social media. We're Bobolink Yarns and Cloverworks Farm on Facebook and on Instagram and at Gmail. And if you have some wool, if you know somebody who has some wool, if you're thinking about getting sheep, I'll talk to you all you want. You'll get bored first, I promise. I really love, providing whatever assistance I can and whatever advice from my experience that I can in helping shepherds realize the value of their wool.
Thank you, Katie. It was wonderful to meet you. Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you so much, Anne. I appreciate getting to chat with you this morning.
I really enjoyed getting to meet Katie. I'm fairly sure I've seen her a few times at various festivals, but the Bobolink Yarns booth is always busy as I go by, so I haven't had a chance to speak with her before now. I had to laugh a little as she was talking about learning to knit and being so worried about dropping stitches that she ended up picking up additional stitches, because I did the same thing. When you are mid-row and you pull your needles apart from one another and see that bar of yarn going from one stitch to the next, I used to think that was a drop stitch. So I basically, anytime I pulled my needles away from each other, I would convince myself I dropped a stitch and I would pick up that bar and keep going. As a new knitter, I knit several squares that were more trapezoidal than squares. One thing I wanted to stress more in the interview is that Bobolinks Yarn has wonderful pattern support for their yarn. You can find their patterns on Ravelry by searching for Cloverworks Farm. And I will have a link in the show notes to their patterns as well. I really do mean what I said in the interview. There is no bad wool. There's just better ways to apply certain wools to certain situations. If you are setting any sort of crafty goals for yourself this year, I would encourage you to add a goal to your list to learn more about the different types of wool, especially those being grown in your area, and how to best use them in your chosen fiber crafts. I will put some links in the show notes to some books and resources that I found helpful in the past, along with all the links to learn more about the Bobolink Yarns. A few more things before I go. A few of you were in touch with additional sources for silk information. Jackie sent me a link to an article about spider silk being woven into fabric in Madagascar. It's incredible. Tegan and Dave told me about a book called The Practical Spinner's Guide to Silk by Sarah Lamb. So I've ordered a copy of that, and I'm waiting patiently for that to arrive so I can learn more about silk. If you would like to learn more about either, I will have links in the show notes to both of those resources that were sent in to me. The Craft Yarn Council is running the Great Yarn Challenge starting the day after this episode goes live. But if you're listening later, you can start late and catch up. Learn more at thegreatyarnchallenge.com. In keeping with my goal to only join knit-alongs that I already have the yarn for, I went stash diving and found enough yarn from the challenge sponsors and Craft Yarn Council members to just be able to make it work. So I'm going to be doing that through the next 6 weeks. Will I keep up? Will I burn out? Probably both. Do you want to join me? Check out thegreatyarnchallenge.com. Finally, I will be working with Jana of the Purl Together podcast over on YouTube to co-host a knit-along starting on March 1st. By the next episode, I will have all the details for that, but know that that is coming. It's a month-long knit-along, and I'll just say now that it's an accessory that is a modern take on a heritage style. We will have suggestions for traditional yarns as well as more modern options. Again, next episode, I'll fill you in more. In the meantime, thank you for listening and knitting with me for a bit. If you'd like to support the show, please visit patreon.com/I-thought-I-knew-how to make a monthly pledge. You may also consider making a purchase from one of our sponsors by visiting the website I-thought-I-knew-how.com and clicking the link at the top that says Be a Booster. While you are on the site, you can also find the show notes for each episode. Thank you ever so much to my patrons, to Knit New Haven, and to Morehouse Farm for sponsoring the podcast. Find me on my social media accounts as I Thought I Knew How, except on Twitter, where it's just Thought I Knew How. The groups on various platforms are all called I Thought I Knew How Podcast. Until next time, may you be blessed with stitches that never drop, yarn without joins, and plenty of time to knit.